SAM team at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and today we'll be talking about modeling behind-the-meter batteries in SAM. This is a part of our 2023 webinar series. Prior webinars included the Geothermal Electricity Technology Evaluation Model, linkages between NREL's DGen, REOPT, and SAM models, financial models for utility-scale projects in SAM, and modeling utility-scale photovoltaic projects in SAM. All of those are recorded and are on the SAM YouTube channel, which can be found at the bottom of the page, or accessed via the SAM website at sam.nrel.gov. For Q&A during the webinar, the interface looks a little bit different depending on how you dialed into the webinar. We have examples of how to find the questions box on this slide. And my teammates will either type an answer to your question during the webinar or save it to the end of the presentation to be answered verbally. So our agenda today, I'll be doing a brief intro to the battery models in SAM and then focused on answering the question under item 6, which dispatch option should I use when? So I'll do a brief overview of all the dispatch options and show some of the trade-offs. And then hopefully we'll be able to, by the end of this webinar, you'll know how to dispatch a battery based on your utility rate, load profile, and other considerations. So to start, for anyone who this is their first SAM webinar, SAM is free software that enables detailed performance and financial analysis for renewable energy systems. It's usually shipped as a desktop application, but we also have a software development kit with the PySAM Python package. And open source repositories, and you can find links to all of those things at our website at the link there, sam.nrel.gov. The SAM battery model can be used to model a variety of battery chemistries, including lithium-ion, lead-acid, and flow batteries. When modeling it with a detailed PV system, you can model it as AC or DC connected. We include battery lifetime models, and based on the outputs of those lifetime models, you can schedule battery replacements and incorporate that into the economics, either on a set schedule or a specified capacity. And then we also have models for voltage, losses, and temperature calculations. Prior battery webinars cover all of those things in a lot more depth and are still up to date given the models in SAM. You can find those at the URL at the bottom of the screen under the battery storage, battery videos heading on the SAM website. And some of those topics include a focus on battery technology, behind-the-meter renewable plus storage system modeling, where we go into more details on system sizing and that type of thing, front-of-meter system modeling, and details on the lifetime models and levelized cost of storage metric. So before I get into the battery dispatch, I'll just show a high level of some of the battery model in SAM. So I've already got my SAM case up here with some pre-run cases. So either when you first open SAM, there will be an option to start a new case, or you can use this add button. And then today we'll be focusing on energy storage with a detailed PV plus battery model. The detailed PV plus battery model has all of the dispatch options that we're covering today available to it. Some of these other options might have somewhat limited options based on what makes sense for that type of system. And then we're going to be looking at the distributed case for behind the meter and the commercial owner. So when that opens up here, you'll notice that the tabs for inputs are on the left. This is a beta version of SAM that we're working towards releasing in the fall. And so some of these input panes have been collapsed under these PV and battery headings. So if I open up the battery one, there are 3 options: battery, cell, and system, battery life, and battery dispatch. Battery, cell, and system includes inputs such as the desired bank power and the desired bank capacity. The capacity can either be specified in kilowatt hours, or you can toggle this option here and set it to hours, in which case the duration will scale with the power. And then if you scroll down a bit here, you get options on setting your battery for AC or DC connected with the PV system. We'll be doing AC connected today, but some other webinars cover the trade-offs between AC and DC connected. And then some of these more detailed voltage, losses, and thermal models are available in these expandable panes down here. All of the inputs in these can be updated via this battery type at the top. So this gives options for various types of lead acid, lithium ion, and flow batteries. For today, we'll just be sticking with the nickel manganese cobalt oxide default, but we will encourage you to look at that battery technology webinar for more details about what these change in the subcomponent models. Battery life, we have a couple different options on this page, including the battery bank replacement. In the default case, we specify at a 50% capacity. We can also specify on a schedule by selecting this option here. For battery life, we have options for cycle and calendar degradation, which some of these cycle degradation metrics might be something more similar to what you might find on a battery spec sheet. But you'll notice when I selected that, the system gives this warning here in red that the best battery life option for nickel manganese cobalt is the NMC graphite life model. And so this NMC and LMO LTO models were developed, algebraic equations developed within NREL that we've implemented in SAM using detailed degradation models from life testing. So this provides a little bit more detail, but really are only applicable to these chemistries. So we'll stick with this since we're using that default chemistry. And then finally, we get to the dispatch page, which we'll be covering in significant detail in the rest of the webinar. So a few definitions as we describe the dispatch options. If I'm referring to something as optimization or optimal dispatch, that means the dispatch algorithm is solving a set of equations to find the best possible solution. Typically, that involves minimizing a life cycle cost or minimizing the utility bill given the dispatch of the battery. A heuristic solution follows a set of rules to find a good solution. So it may not be as good as the optimal solution, but it still is providing value to the battery, and we'll get into the trade-offs between some of these later in the presentation. And then typically, although not always, we're evaluating these dispatch options based on what sort of net present value the system ends up with over the lifetime of the system with the given dispatch option. And that's just the sum of discounted cash flows over the life of the project. So in our upcoming fall SAM release, we will have 7 dispatch options. This is up from 6 in the prior release. The dispatch options include peak shaving, which looks at a generation and load forecast in order to reduce peak demand charges. Input grid power targets looks at a monthly or time series of targets of whether the battery should be charging or discharging based on the projected grid power. And it's a pretty similar algorithm to the peak shaving algorithm, but allows a little bit more user specification of those targets. Input battery power targets is a time series based dispatch algorithm where the user is actually specifying the battery is charging or discharging at each individual time step. We typically see that used with PySAM or some type of outside optimization such as Reopt. Manual dispatch specifies the schedule by hour and month, and we typically see that used for energy arbitrage with time of use rates. We have the utility rate dispatch algorithm, which was formerly known as price signals dispatch, which utilizes those upcoming generation and load forecasts as well as the utility rates. And we've seen it's best used when there's a mix of time of use charges and demand charges. And it's also one of the only built-in algorithms to SAM that's actively accounting for battery degradation costs in its dispatch. The one that's new is the self-consumption dispatch, which is an easy way to enter a grid power target of 0, which we anticipate will be useful for system sizing for meeting a whole system load. And then we also have the grid outage dispatch option, which looks at the current PV generation and the critical load. Note that this is the only one that looks at critical load. All the other ones look at the full load of the system, and that's used in resilience analysis. So I know that was a ton of information, but don't worry, we'll be going into more detail on all of these, starting with manual dispatch. So if I switch this option here to manual dispatch, it loads the schedule by month and hour that I was talking about earlier. And since I said that this was most useful for energy arbitrage with time of use rates, it behooves us to look at the electricity rates that are in use here. So this is just a hypothetical default utility rate that we ship with the commercial model in SAM. And it has 4 time of use periods that vary with seasons. So there's winter rates and summer rates. And then it looks like there's a peak charge from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. each day. So keeping that in mind, if we go back to the manual dispatch page, there's this option for copy schedules from time of use electricity rates that I'll click on right now. And now you'll notice that the schedule for the weekday and weekend battery dispatch match the schedule for the time of use rates. You can also go in and edit these by hand by painting over with the mouse and other entries, and then you can use your keyboard 1 through 6 in order to specify the 6 periods. Note that the battery dispatch supports fewer periods than what's available for the electricity rates. So you might, if you have something with monthly rates or otherwise up to, we support up to 36 time of use periods. So you might have to combine some in order to do battery dispatch. And then the high cost periods we noted were these periods 1 and 3 from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. So let's go ahead and set the battery to discharge during those periods. This rate percent suggests that the maximum that the battery will discharge in that hour is 25% of its available storage capacity. So note that we're doing 25% across 5 hours. I'm actually going to leave that alone because we have some of these options here, such as charge from system only when system exceeds load, and charge from battery only when load exceeds system output, and sort of constrain the battery dispatch to make sure that the PV generation is accounted for. And so in this case, if say the PV generation was 50 kilowatts and the load was 100 kilowatts, this would limit the dispatch to, or discharging to 50 kilowatts, even if the battery could discharge more than that. And then finally, I'll just set up charge from system during periods 2 and 4 to allow charging during these lower cost times. And so I've only changed the battery dispatch option, so I'm just going to be using the SAM defaults for the rest of the inputs when I click simulate here. And this will take, with the current configuration, about 20 seconds to run the detailed PV and battery model. So now that that's done, it takes us to this output page, and we can see some summary metrics here, including that the manual dispatch has a net present value of $478,000. We can also look at things on this summary page, such as the heat map of the annual AC energy. So we can see times during the day when the PV is providing up to 416 kilowatts of generation, and then see times during those evening hours in which the battery is discharging to cover the load in those hours. And typically, the system is not running overnight, which makes sense given the dispatch that we set up. We can also look at the time series outputs, which we'll be doing for some of the other dispatch options. The default time series output is the total system power generated, so in this case, PV plus battery. For this one, I'm going to look at electricity to from battery AC and put that in a lower window. And then we can zoom in and look at what's going on within that month. And so we see that charging, let's go ahead and zoom down to a week so we can get more time information. See that charging in the late morning and discharging in the early evening. And then we didn't specify any discharging on weekends, so the battery just charges on Saturday and then stays charged until Monday. So with that, the next one to look at is this input battery power targets. So if we click on that, we get a different set of inputs down here and a different set of options up here. I will note that this battery can charge from clip power that's only available to DC systems. So we'd have to go back to that battery cell and system page in order to have that be enabled. Battery discharge to grid now applies on a time step basis. For manual dispatch, we had that option here for steps in which the battery was discharging, and that can override some of these items up here in order to allow for discharging to the grid if that's allowed in your region. So input battery power targets has a time series array of DC powers in which you could specify kilowatts of charging or discharging. Less than 0 is to charge the battery, greater than 0 is to discharge. So you can set this up however you like. Frequently we see people using this to test out some different battery parameters in the performance model. What I'm going to demonstrate today is getting dispatch from a different NREL tool, Reopt, which provides, it can be accessed as a website, but they also have an API and open source code, which allows for optimizing both system sizing and dispatch. So the SAM input for that is actually on the battery cell and system page, which is this optimal system sizing and dispatch from Reopt, in which we have set up the API calls to translate the SAM inputs into the Reopt inputs, and then the outputs for battery power, capacity, and dispatch into the SAM inputs. So if you click on that here, you first get a warning that notifies that we have to change some of those checkboxes in order to support the Reopt default dispatch, such as battery charging from the grid. So we'll say yes to that. And then I'm actually going to cancel out of this because this is going to take about 1.5 minutes, and go to the one that I did before the webinar. This might just take a few minutes, so I'm going to go back to the slides while that thinks about what it's doing. So while we're waiting for the Reopt call to cancel, I'll just describe the grid power target, because I think some of the concepts here will be useful for understanding the optimal dispatch. So 3 of the SAM dispatch algorithms work on what we call grid power targets, and that target is a number in kilowatts. In the example there on the right, it's 7 kilowatts. And so for a given target in a time step, SAM will do its best to dispatch the battery to meet that target. So if the projected grid use, or load minus generation, is greater than the target, the battery will discharge in order to try to bring that grid use down. And if it's less than the target, it will charge. So for our peak shaving dispatch algorithm, that's computed every 24 hours based on the battery capacity, so the full depth of discharge of the battery each day, the forecast of energy coming from the system, and the forecast of the load. And then given that forecast for the next 24 hours, the peak shaving algorithm will sort and try to figure out how many hours of grid use can the battery discharge successfully to lower the target. If there isn't sufficient energy available, either from the battery being charged or from, there isn't sufficient generation, the battery will not cycle that day. And then one of the features in the peak shaving algorithm is that it's looking at a monthly maximum peak. And so it assumes that if a peak has already occurred, then it will not discharge for values lower than that peak. So even if the grid use on a given day is going to be lower than that peak, it'll just let that happen and wait for the next time the battery, the grid use to potentially exceed the monthly peak in order to discharge. If you have something like a coincident peak in your rate, you might be interested in like the time series grid power target in order to deal with those coincident peak charges. Okay, so that actually returned. So we waited long enough for Reopt to return. So it's giving us optimal capacity values that were slightly lower than our default values. So it's lowering the power to 170 kilowatts and the energy capacity to 877 kilowatt hours. So we'll let it override those inputs. And then if we go back to the dispatch page, the time series array here in the input battery power targets is populated. So you'll see on this first day, it charges a little bit it discharges a little bit in the evening with that initial state of charge, and then charges from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then discharges again in the evening. So I actually already ran that case earlier. So we can look at electricity to from battery AC. We were looking at the first week of May with manual dispatch. And so you'll notice that this is charging and discharging for a lot more hours than what manual dispatch was doing. So it's pretty much, discharging from, it looks like, 6 p.m. until about 6 a.m., and then it charges from 9 a.m. to noon, and then waits for a few hours while there's plenty of PV generation, and then discharges again. If we want to look at the data tables, we can see a little bit more what's going on with the utility bill. So something we're going to be looking at for a few of these is the demand peak with system. So in each month, how many kilowatts, the default utility rate for the commercial model in SAM includes demand charges. And so this, number of kilowatts peak demand has a significant impact on the bill. And so if we compare, we don't have our manual dispatch anymore. That's okay. If we compare this to the peak without system, then we can see that it's reducing it from 234 kilowatts in January to 82. So that's quite successful. So next we'll look at that peak shaving algorithm. So this utilizes these forecasts. The default is to look at perfect look ahead, so giving it 24 hours of advanced information. I should note that the re-op dispatch, by default, the way we have the API call set up, the re-op dispatch is doing a full year's worth of dispatch forecast. So we can really see those peaks coming far in advance in order to get that optimal dispatch. So for peak shaving, we're only going to give it a day. We also have options to look behind and set the grid power target based on yesterday's forecast. That's going to matter more at the beginning of the month. At the end of the month, we wouldn't expect that to change too much. And as well as a custom forecast if you wanted to look at forecast errors based on historical forecasts versus historical data. And you can do the same thing with load as well as the weather file. So if we press simulate, we'll get our peak shaving with look ahead dispatch. And this, you can see it's a little bit similar to what we were seeing from the re-op optimal dispatch, but generally it's not discharging as late into the night. So once we get to, this midnight or 1 a.m. period, we have very little grid discharge during that time. And then this is also at the beginning of the month. So you can sort of see towards the end of the month, there's a little bit less discharging since those peaks have already been reached. If you want to see what the target is doing, let me turn off this system power generated. We have this output electricity grid power target for automated dispatch. And that's going to be a lot more interesting if I zoom out a little bit. So you can see at the beginning of May, the battery is being really ambitious and trying to solve that grid power target to within 10 kilowatts. And then within a few days, it's backed off to about 37 kilowatts. And so you can see how that varies a little bit month to month. January has a relatively high target near 80 kilowatts. Some of the rest of the months are lower. And then if we go back to the data tables, we can look at the electricity or the monthly demand data and look at the demand peak with and without system. And this is, holding these peaks with, I think, the exception of August, relatively close to that target that we were looking at the previous page. So January is only 78 kilowatts, April is only 37, May is only 35, as opposed to some of the pre-peak, pre-system peaks. So if we look at the summary, that net present value is good for $629,000. So that's one of the best ones we've seen so far. The other option that we provide is allowing users to specify their own grid power targets. So if we go back to the dispatch page, and let me just check these boxes so we're looking at the same as what we were doing previously. Input grid power targets here gives you the option of monthly or time series power targets. So if we specify monthly, we can do a value in kilowatts for each month. So let's just see what happens if we apply 60 kilowatts to all of the months. We go, so first we'll note that this has a lower net present value than our prior case. We'll go to the monthly demand peaks again. And the battery is actually very successful at each month holding that demand peak to 60 kilowatts. But that's still higher for some months, such as April and May, than the target that the peak shaving set. So this, sort of shows that the peak shaving algorithm might have had some kind of forecast error or something that allowed those higher peaks in January and August. To sort of suggest that, a detailed setup with these grid power targets could do a little bit better than the peak shaving if we were to go in and set these all month by month. So then finally, we'll look at the self-consumption dispatch. So this is just setting that grid power target to 0, which allows for sizing, in applications that are potentially looking at 24/7 carbon-free energy. And if we press simulate, then we see that these demand peaks actually end up being a little bit higher than we saw before. So this is a little bit, perhaps too ambitious given the system size that we had here, but that's okay. So the point of this dispatch is to allow for adjusting those system sizes. And then similarly, if we're looking at this electricity battery power target for automated, electricity grid power target for automated dispatch, we can see that that's 0 in all of the months. All right, so 5 down, 2 more to go. Second to last here is price signals dispatch. So this algorithm is laid out on the slide here and is detailed in the publication at the bottom, which we'll have a detailed reference to on one of the last slides of the presentation. So the price signals dispatch algorithm is attempting to forecast the cost of utility bill without dispatch. It then schedules discharge to the load for the highest cost periods, according to, or in proportion to the cost of each period. So if you had 2 periods that were relatively high cost, you'd see roughly 50% of the discharge in those periods and not a lot in the rest of them. It then schedules charging for the lowest marginal cost periods. Then it does a pass through, this is going for 1 day. It reduces discharging or charging based on the expected state of charge at each step, and then repeats steps 2 through 4 to generate plans with 0 to 12 hours of dispatch, and then finally adds up the costs for each of those plans for the utility bill, the number of cycles, so therefore the expected degradation of the battery and the cost of the battery replacement, as well as the marginal cost of remaining energy in the battery. So it sort of incentivizes storing up charge for things outside of the forecast period. So this, in the current edition, takes about 2.5 minutes to run. So we just set it up here with the perfect look-ahead forecast. We also have this cycle degradation penalty, which can be calculated automatically based on the degradation of the battery and the cost of replacement that's specified on the O&M page, or you can specify it on a cycle per kilowatt hour basis to attempt to fine-tune that a little bit more. And if we look at the electricity to from battery AC, we're seeing a quite different discharge pattern than what we've seen before. It sort of ends up being a little bit of a hybrid of the manual dispatch and the peak shaving dispatch, in which it's both trying to shave peaks and shift time of use rates. To quantify that in more detail, we did a sensitivity analysis as a part of the paper that I did with Therese Guite, in which we took California utility rate and then varied the maximum energy charge from 10 cents to 50 cents per kilowatt hour, the ratio of the least expensive time of use period to the most expensive time of use period from 1 to 10, the fixed demand charge from $0 per kilowatt to $59 per kilowatt, and the time of use demand charge from 0 to $13.45 per kilowatt. And so that, given the intermediate steps that we took on each of these, left us with 625 different utility rates to analyze. So we took a little bit of time on NREL Supercomputer Eagle to run all these different cases with our 3 different dispatch algorithms to see which performed best. So in the chart on the left, we're looking at the number of cases within each bin that had the maximum NPV. Note that it doesn't add up to that 625 because in some cases PV only had the maximum NPV. And then on the right, the number of cases where that dispatch strategy outperformed PV only. So the battery provided some value. So on the left, the x-axis is the demand charge percentage, or how much of the utility bill without system was composed of demand charges based on that sensitivity that we were doing before. So we saw a couple different buckets, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, and so on. And generally, if you were below roughly 20% of that bill without system, going to demand charges, manual dispatch was the best choice. In the cases in the middle, we saw a little bit mixed, but those were the cases where price signals tend to do well. There were 37 cases where it outperformed the other algorithms. And then once you get above 40 or 50% of your bill being demand charges, the peak shaving dispatch tends to provide the most value. The one caveat to this is battery replacements. So if you look at the chart on the right, the 3 dispatch algorithms all outperform PV in 100 to 170 cases if the battery is replaced at 50% of its capacity. If the battery needs to be replaced at 80% of its capacity, then price signals dispatch was the only algorithm to outperform PV. So the 2 takeaways here are: 1, which dispatch algorithm to use depends on your utility rate, especially the percentage of demand charges. I know on paper, given the algorithm, it looks like price signals dispatch looks like it could always be the best, but that didn't actually work out in practice. So happy to go into that more in the Q&A if that's a question. But then if you are in a situation where you're really concerned about battery replacement costs, price signals dispatch is going to provide more value than some of the other algorithms. And then finally here, we have a grid outage and some resilience analysis features that we'd like to cover. So I'll first note that the grid outage dispatch is only available with the detailed models in SAM. We didn't make this available with PV watts. That's because there's some losses that occur in real systems, such as inverter nighttime losses, that this algorithm accounts for, that we really think it's beneficial to account for in your analysis. These all take critical load as an input. And so that can be done as a percentage of load or as a detailed time series if you have time series information about your critical load. And then we provide 2 different ways to analyze the autonomy of the system during a grid outage. One is what I would refer to as the hypothetical outage at every step. So in every step of the simulation, it calculates the autonomy going forward as if the battery or as if the power went out during that step. And this is good because in some grids, the power can go out at any time. And so you'd want to know how many hours of autonomy that you have in an average case. But this doesn't propagate back to either the economics or the battery degradation. So we also have the option of specifying an outage using a time series input. And this affects the utility bill in that the utility isn't charging you for any power during the outage and you can't draw power from the grid. It affects the battery state of charge. So when you come out of the outage, you have to recharge the battery in order to meet the battery's economic dispatch, and it also impacts the battery lifetime. This is using an iterative dispatch model that we refer to grid outage dispatch. It is basically just a self-consumption model, but it has very detailed loss accounting. And so it will, one of the issues that we can see is as the power flowing through the inverter changes, the inverter efficiency changes. So this is going to iterate through each step multiple times in order to make sure that it meets all of those losses exactly. So it's a little bit slower to run than the self-consumption model, which is why we provide both. But we do want, to demonstrate this for you, so you all know that SAM can do critical load analysis. So that comes on. You'll notice that we just have these 6 dispatch options here. You can activate this option by going to the grid outage page, which includes specifications for the critical electric load, specifications of the grid outage duration, and then that choice of autonomy calculations that I mentioned earlier. So let's just start with a 50% critical load. That's totally arbitrary. You can specify the time series. You can also specify the critical load annual growth rate separately from the load growth rate on the electric load page. I will note, once you specify a critical load, you can see the critical load percentages on the electrical load page. So we have the full load on the left and the critical load on the right. And then I'm just going to go in here. By default, the grid is on the whole time for this input. So I'm just going to go in here and specify a 4-hour outage on the first day of January by turning all of these to 1s. So then if we run this, it should take about the same amount of time as the previous one, since we don't have too many outage steps. All right, so then if we go back to our time series outputs, there's a couple of new outputs based on activating that grid outage module. So there's critical load in this time step, which is basically just showing 50% of the load given the way that I specified it. And then also critical load on MET in this time step, which let's get it on this one, which happens to be 0. So for this relatively short outage duration, the system was able to meet the critical load during the entire outage. There's also an hourly grid outage in this time step. Let's put it on this one, such that you can see specifically where that outage is. So the green line is showing the duration of the outage. We can plot the, let's take a few of these things off here to make this a little bit less messy. We can plot then the battery state of charge and see that actually during most of the outage, it looks like PV was meeting the full load, which is great. So that means that oh yeah, a couple other things to note here. So on the battery dispatch page, we specify this minimum and maximum state of charge. These apply to the economic dispatch algorithms. We assume during a grid outage that you want to charge the battery to 100%. So that's what happened here. Normally, this wouldn't go above 95%, but we allow it to charge to 100% during the outage. And since the outage happened to happen in the middle of the day, there was PV generation available to do that. And then this grid outage also specifies a minimum battery state of charge. And the reason that the default here is 10% is such that if for some reason the battery can't meet all of the critical load during the night, it still has some state of charge to reestablish frequency in the morning and keep the PV system on and give itself some chance of recharging the next day. So you can change this depending on your manufacturer specifications or other analysis, but just note that this this is where that's specified. I also ran a case where I selected this calculate hours of autonomy for a hypothetical outage with 100% critical load. I'll note that because this is running forward from every step, if your system is a little bit oversized, this can get very slow with low critical load percentages or oversized systems. So the reason that this is 100% is the other one is 50% is so that this one finished in a reasonable amount of time. And that provides some additional graphs and outputs, including this summary autonomy during grid outages. And so, it looks like if you start at the right hour of the year, for about, 10% of hours, you could potentially run the system off grid for about 500 hours. However, for, in terms of having an 80% probability of surviving the outage, that looks like it's going to be more like 40-ish hours based on this. So you can get into more details on this in the data tables under this 1080 values here. And that provides more details on the hours of autonomy and probability of survival. All right, so with that, just wrap up with some help resources and references. We always like to mention that the help system in SAM is great and context sensitive. So on any page, grid outage page, dispatch pages, you can read more by pressing the F1 key or clicking help. We have a user forum with lots of previous user questions that have been answered that access through the website. And then if for some reason you can't post in the forum or want more direct support, you can email sam.support@nrel.gov. Related resources, we have details on all of the publications that underlie our battery models, all of the previous videos that we've made on battery trainings, and the financial models that were ultimately calculating that net present value. And then the 2 papers that underpin the peak shaving and utility rates dispatch algorithm are listed below. Thank you to all of you for listening and to the team, and any questions?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Brian. This is Paul Gilman. I'm helping facilitate here. There are a couple questions here. The first one is from John, and he's asking if there's been any thought to adding capability to model coincident peak rate.
No, yeah, no, we have not incorporated that into our plan to date, but we'd be happy to chat about your use case and see if there's some other way to model that in there, and also, collect some information about why it's important so we can incorporate it into our future plans.
I would add we probably want to think about incorporating into utility rate database in the same process. So it's potentially a question that's bigger than just the SAM activity.
And that was Nate Blair, for folks who don't know Nate's voice.
Thank you.
And then another question is from Lynn. Is there any manual entry for battery calendar degradation or for temperature degradation?
That's a good question. So, yeah, so I went back to the battery life page. I changed from NMC graphite to calendar degradation. And if you go to custom calendar degradation, you can specify that in terms of battery age and capacity fade. If you look at our empirical model, you'll note that temperature is also a prominent variable in the empirical calendar degradation. Unfortunately, our custom input does not support that right now. But for reversible changes in battery thermal behavior, you can go down to this battery thermal page and specify the temperature and capacity fade. So for example, this NMC default loses 20% of its capacity as things cool off between 23 and 0C. The other thing, while we're on this topic, I'll note that the default is that the battery is in a conditioned environment. So we've set this to be a single environment temperature at 25C. We also provide this option to enter a time series temperature so that you can do things like copy the temperature time series out of the weather file and paste that in here if your battery is situated outdoors and doesn't have a good thermal management system.
Great. And we have another question here from Neil. Is there analysis on quality of inverters concerning grid forming inverters for non-grid forming inverters?
Yeah, so I would say within SAM, we're looking at everything in real power. These battery inverter calculations for the AC connected battery just use a flat efficiency. If you use the DC connected battery, then it is using the same inverter as modeled on the PV page, which is using, by default, the CEC inverter model. As far as grid forming versus not grid forming, Nate, are there other NREL tools we would recommend for that type of analysis?
NREL has a whole series of tools that model both distribution grid and other things with regards to black start in particular, where grid forming inverters really play in. It's more of a system operations type of modeling, which usually happens at the hour or sub-hour or less, and resiliency modeling, and less of a kind of a techno-economic analysis question that Sam is able to answer. I think from a SAM perspective, you would maybe want to say, look, for other reasons, we want to have grid forming inverters, so we're going to enter in the cost and the characteristics from a SAM perspective for those grid forming inverters, but we are not in SAM going to model the actual outage and then the reboot and the formation of the frequency signal. So there's a number of tools that other people at NREL use to look at grid stability, frequency, voltage, etc. So we would probably point you in those directions.
Great, and Neil responds, perfect, thanks. There's another question from John. Maybe I can take this one. He asked, can you remind us how to find sample SAM model cases already run, which may help set up new cases? And the answer to that is that when you create a new case in SAM, it's essentially a sample file. So if you create a PV battery commercial case, for example, that creates a sample file for a PV battery system with financial model for a commercial application. And the inputs are all populated with default values, and you can just click simulate right off the bat to see what the results look like. And then from that default case or sample case, you can start making modifications to do your own analysis.
Thanks, Paul.
And we have a comment from Gustavo. He says, excellent presentation. Are all these capabilities available in the Python PySAM package?
So yes, so with the exception of this self-consumption dispatch option here, all of these can be set in PySAM. Let me just pull up my browser and show where to find that in documentation. There we go. So if we search, let's see. This might be a little bit confusing, but it'll make sense in a second. So the model that I was using was the detailed PV plus battery model. If you're running this from PySAM, it's worth noting that PVSAM v1 includes all of the battery inputs. So depending on what you're doing, you can either use the PVSAM v1 model or the standalone battery model. And so if we look at the reason for that is the DC connected battery. Just the way that the code is set up, if you want to run the DC connected battery, all the inverter has to be tied together and all of that other stuff. So if you go down to the battery dispatch group and go to bat dispatch choice, then you can see each of these battery dispatch options with, the spaces conveniently removed for readability, and which corresponds to the dispatch options in the GUI. The one exception, of course, is self-consumption dispatch, which we aren't releasing until the fall release.
And just to follow up on that, Brian, it might be worth mentioning that if you're working in PySAM, particularly for models that are complicated to set up, like a PV battery configuration, it's often a good approach is to set things up in SAM and get it running the way you want there, and then use the code generator to export the inputs from SAM to JSON that you can then read into your PySAM modules. And Brian here is showing the code generator. And this process is described in the PySAM documentation. There's a section on getting inputs from SAM. Importing inputs from SAM there, fifth down, yeah.
And that shows what I was just showing on the GUI.
Okay, we have another question here from Alejandro. Thanks a lot for the nice presentation. Have you tested which is the level of accuracy of the model versus real world data, especially around savings predicted versus obtained?
Yeah, so I hate that I still have to give this answer, but a lot of the time, the battery manufacturers, the dispatch algorithm is their secret sauce. So that's all very proprietary information that's difficult to access to do a true real world study like you're describing. What we did do in a recent paper, which maybe still needs to be added to the SAM website, we'll check, is compare day-ahead forecasts to perfect forecasts for Puerto Rico, and found that for, this is one building in Puerto Rico, so a little bit of a limited sample size, that the decrease in value of perfect versus day-ahead forecasts for some of the heuristic algorithms was on the order of 1%, and for some of the optimal algorithms was on the order of 8%. So that's, I think, yeah, that's going to be public on OSTI if you search Brian Meerlitz on Google Scholar or OSTI, that should turn up pretty quickly, and we'll double check and make sure that's on the same website as well.
Yeah, and I might just add that on the SAM website, there is a page called PV Validation that has a list of papers that compare model results to measure data and compare results between different models. So not battery specific, but that is a resource.
Yeah, and we have done some validations of the battery model as compared to those degradation tests that formed our degradation algorithms, and found pretty good agreement at low temperatures, at least.
Okay, I don't see any more typed questions. I'll just check to see if anyone's raised their hand. We could take questions by voice as well. So we do have a few more minutes left. If there are any remaining questions, we'll wait a moment or two in case someone's typing. And we could also mention that Brian has alluded to a new update to SAM. We're hoping to release this fall in the October to November timeframe. So keep an eye out for an email about that, or we'll announce it also in the welcome page on when you first start SAM. Okay, here's another question, comment from Lynn. Great presentation. Is PV plus storage site aggregation something on the SAM roadmap, or would that be out of scope?
I'm going to interpret that question as something like a virtual power plant, where you would be aggregating multiple behind-the-meter batteries into one dispatchable resource. I think I think that would be relatively straightforward to do in PySAM. So how I would approach that would be basically, depending on the geographic distribution of the systems, potentially run the PV model with different weather files across that geographic distribution, and then do different battery models, and then provide some sort of signal to aggregate those and look at the economics of that. Within the GUI, that's a little bit trickier, just because within the GUI, you're only ever going to get one of each resource. And so that, I think, would be a little bit trickier to do in the GUI, but it should be straightforward to do in PySAM.
Thanks. And he did follow up saying, yes, like for VPP. So I think you correctly interpreted the question. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Here's one from Roman about PV modeling. Is there a chance for another option for PV modeling east-west orientation? Right now, SAM assumes that all panels are oriented in ... I think the this question is probably about one-axis tracking, where if the tracker, so if okay, he's still typing, so we'll give him a second. Brian, it might be helpful to open that help system here. I think there's some diagrams that show the definitions of the tilt and azimuth values for one-axis tracking there. So for the default azimuth angle of 180 degrees, the tracking axis is north-south, and the tracker would orient the modules, from east to west as we're moving throughout the day. And I suspect this question is about having the array track seasonally with an east-west tracking axis. But there's no option for other geometry where the rows are east-west. So yeah, we may let's take this question offline. Roman, if you could follow up at sam.support@nrel.gov or post a question on the SAM forum on the website, we can give you a more detailed question or response there. All right, well, I think we're out of time. Thanks, Brian, for the great webinar. We'll be posting the recording on the SAM website. And thank you everyone for participating. And feel free to get in touch with us if you have further questions. The SAM forum is a great place to reach out, but we're also happy to take emails as well. All right, goodbye and have a great rest of your day.